Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Robert Litvak, the Wilson Center's Vice President for Scholars and Director of International Security Studies. I'd like to welcome you to today's meeting, which is co-sponsored by the Center's History and Public Policy program, headed by Christian Osterman. He is out of town today. And the Middle East program, directed by Hale Esfandiari. The issue today could not be more topical, ISIS and the end of the Middle East as we know it. While Western attention is caught by the rise of the so-called Islamic State, the real story may be the dissolution of order in the Middle East. How do we understand ongoing political and geopolitical shifts in the region and the rise of new types of actors, such as the Islamic State? And what, if anything, can and should Western powers do? New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman has written a series of columns recently about the world of disorder versus the world of order. And he's contrasted the current crisis in the Middle East to that during the Cold War era, which he described as a clash between contending versions of order. I mean, the Soviet Union, whatever one thought of it, was a competing alternative order, international order of sorts, whereas what one's seeing now in the Middle East is the crisis of and within states, Syria and Iraq, and the United States in its strategy attempting to enlist this coalition of 40 states with often competing objectives and approaches to how the issue should be addressed, being brought together to address it. So to address this complex new reality in the Middle East, we're fortunate to have today with us Professor Dr. Volker Perthes, who is the director of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik in Berlin. A main function of the SWP is to give advice to the German Parliament and government on international affairs. Volker has served as previously as head of the SWP's Middle East and Africa Research Division. His work as director of the entire institute has spanned beyond the Middle East to address European crises such as the Ukraine-Russia issue. But as he was telling me before we arrived, the Middle East has sort of pulled him back. Events on the ground have pulled him back into what was his primary academic and professional work. His doctorate was in Middle East studies. He's published widely on the international politics of the Middle East. He, in addition to being director of the SWP, is a professor at Humboldt University and the Free University of Berlin. He will speak for about 25 minutes. This meeting was originally posted to run to 2 o'clock. We're going to not run the full 90 minutes, more like an hour, depending on your questions and comments. Volker will speak for 25 minutes or so, and then we'll have a bit of a conversation at the desk, and then open it up for comments and questions from the floor. So with that, please welcome Volker Perthes.
Well, thanks, Bob. You're right. In a way, the Middle East is pulling me back all the time. I was originally supposed to speak about German foreign policy here, and then your colleague said, "Well, no one is really interested in that." But if you can say something about, say something about the Islamic State and the Middle East, that would be welcome. And so I'm pulled back to it. And indeed, I think if we think about a big headline, how to describe developments, dynamics in the Middle East, the big headline would be dissolution of order. It's dissolution of order on a regional level, particularly in the Levant, which means from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. Dissolution of order on a state level, particularly, but not only in Syria and Iraq. And some people would even say dissolution of a moral order, if you think of the return of sectarianism or confessionalism and the breakdown of a always difficult but lasting tradition of coexistence between different sects and ethnicities in the Middle East. Now, the regional order, we also call it the Sykes-Picot order, or the post-Ottoman, or the post-World War I order in the Middle East. We sometimes forget it has been rather stable for almost 100 years, certainly more stable than the regional order in Europe, where I come from. It has shaped only 4 to 5 political generations, and mainly they were brought up in learning to hate the regional order, learning that the Sykes-Picot order is a bad order imposed by foreign colonialists. And what they are now realizing, in a way, is that the alternative to a bad order, which they were socialized into fighting, that the alternative to a bad order is not necessarily a better order, but probably no order. And they're also realizing that there is no one there to build a new order, neither international actors such as the United States or Europe. We're not going to try again to build that order. I'm going to come back to it. And regional actors seem not yet to be up to something like a Vienna Congress or a concert of powers to bring back order to the region. Plus, what we are seeing is whenever there is a general feeling of uncertainty, insecurity, disorder among people, when states and governments don't promise any future anymore to people, then the power of attraction of pre-state, pre-modern identities and images is increasing. Or more concretely, then suddenly, when your state doesn't offer you anything in terms of future, it becomes relevant whether 1,400 years ago the succession of the Prophet of Islam was the right one or the wrong one, and you start to dealing with it as if it was yesterday's conflict, or the battles between the Abbasids and the Fatimids and the Crusaders certainly are drawn back into a very selective memory, or certain symbols such as a black flag of the Abbasids, or ruling from Raqqa, where actually an Abbasid caliph ruled from, become powerful symbols of mobilization, particularly, of course, if they are supported by the power of modern arms and in the absence of functioning states. That is, I think, where we are. I don't know where we are going, but as a political analyst, and I guess many of you are political analysts, we know what we should watch. We should watch socio-political and socio-economic developments and dynamics. We should watch the development of ideologies and identities, and of course we should watch geopolitical dynamics. Without going too much into detail here, I would still maintain that the heart of the turbulences from North Africa to the Persian Gulf will remain local politics. On a very generalized level, we could say questions of inclusion and exclusion, of dignity, of justice, or on a more abstract level, the fact that the old social contract, which was very much built on authoritarianism cum development, that this old social contract is no longer delivering, is no longer functioning. And this old social contract, authoritarianism plus development based on oil money, is very much one part of the Middle East as we know it. If today you look at political, economic, and not least demographic indicators, they all suggest that we are just at the beginning of a long period, probably 10, 20 years period of turbulence, which I think will leave no country of the region unaffected, also some of the countries which still seem stable today. We also see, second point, that ideology and questions of identity are back very strongly. Ideology now seems mainly to be a struggle about the right form of political Islam, at the expense, unfortunately, of more liberal and secular thought, which of course we have had in the Arab world and the region. And mind you, it's not just between Sunnah and Shia, as our press sometimes reports. I think the longer struggle, and probably the more violent struggle and more difficult struggle, will be the struggle for hegemony within Sunni Islam, within the Sunnah. And there is a geopolitical overlay, which probably interests us most, particularly when we work in think tanks like Stiftung Wissenschaft and Politik or the Wilson Center. One factor that probably speaks more to the nature of the international system than to the nature of the regional system is the tendency of all major international actors, the US or Europe or Russia even, or China, the tendency of all major international actors to rather contain threats from the region than getting involved in the region with the aim of re-engineering regional states or re-engineering a regional order. Even the coalition against the Islamic State, I would say, is proof to this. We want to contain a risk, we want to contain a threat, but not necessarily get involved by rebuilding states, societies, or regional order. Certainly there is no appetite for a new Sykes-Picot among the British and the French, no appetite for a Dayton type of enforced settlement among the Americans, be that for Syria, be that for Israel, and Palestine. Which also means that regional actors, regional powers, are much more in control, or should be in control, at least they are defining the action. Without, again, going into detail here about what individual regional states are doing or not doing, I think it's important for us to understand that Syria and Iraq today are a theater which is a theater which is at the center of all political, geopolitical, ideological, or identitarian struggles. Syria and Iraq being two would-be modern nation states which have failed, partly, of course, as a result of external intervention, partly or largely as a result of the failure of local elites to build inclusive systems, thereby giving space for a geopolitical competition between others, particularly between Saudi Arabia and Iran, plus some other powers, confessional or sectarian polarization, and the rise of new type of actors, which we find difficult to deal with because we don't know them so far. So here is the other part of the Middle East as we know it, which seems to be disappearing or changing more than makes us remember it or see it as it was. The Middle East as we know it seems to be disappearing, and this regardless of the, I guess I have a few university people here, so I have to say, regardless of the epistemological question, which part of reality we actually know when we speak about the Middle East as we know it. Now, this part we know, in this part we know there are some things that are definitely different. For the first time, Syria and Iraq are no longer having an active geopolitical role in the region, but they have both become the theater of geopolitical action at the same time. For the first time, and that's probably more important, civil wars in the Middle East are no longer contained in the borders of the country where it takes place, in contrast to what happened in Lebanon for 15 years, in Algeria, in Sudan, even in Iraq after the American invasion there in 2004, when the civil war erupted. So conflicts are, rather than being contained, they are migrating across borders, and borders are evaporating or losing relevance. For the first time also, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is certainly not resolved, but has led to a 50 days war this summer, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is no longer in the center of regional events. And we witness the emergence of quasi-sovereign entities which may or may not call themselves a state. There are easier cases, and there's one very difficult case. And the easier cases, of course, is things like the Kurdish regional government, which basically aspires to be a regional entity in the international system. We can deal with these kind of questions, even though there are conflicts around it. The same goes basically even for the PKK-run or Syrian PKK-run Kurdish enclaves in Syria. They also want to be respected, recognized entities in an international system. But what is much more difficult, even intellectually, to grasp is the emergence of the so-called Islamic State. I fear we haven't really understood what is happening there, and I can only try to give a few elements of understanding. Even President Obama, when he, in his speech, 10th September this year, said that the so-called Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant is neither Islamic nor a state, I think he expressed what the majority of Muslims around the world think, but I fear he is not entirely right. And when the media are saying, or are speaking about this phenomenon, the Islamic State, mainly as a terror group or a terror militia, I think they may underestimate the quality and the threat of this phenomenon. My suggestion is that we need to understand and deal with this phenomenon, so-called Islamic State, as a jihadist state-building project, realizing that they're actually controlling a third of Syria and a third of Iraq approximately today, with up to 8 million people living there, that they are effectively exercising state functions. Some people call it governance. They are administering justice in a very barbaric way, but they are administering their justice. They are imposing taxes, they are recruiting soldiers, they are policing towns, they are running oil fields, they are exporting oil, they are securing market supplies, a lot of things which states normally do. Now, if we say we cannot ignore that they are a state-building project, we also have to be clear what kind of state-building project it is. It is clearly totalitarian. Think about the way they think about minorities, or they deal with minorities, or everybody who thinks differently from them. It is clearly expansionist, and they have made that very clear in rebranding themselves by dropping the geographical suffix Syria and Iraq and saying we're only the Islamic State. And they're also clearly a hegemonic project in the way that their leader, Abu Bakr Baghdadi, by calling himself a caliph and calling his state a caliphate, claims the allegiance of Muslims all over the world, regardless where they live. Of course, it doesn't mean that Muslims would accept that, but he's claiming their allegiance and basically defining that those are good Muslims or those are real Muslims who pay allegiance and loyalty to me. And it is certainly not a state-building project which aims at membership in the United Nations or diplomatic relations with Germany or with the United States. So a further expansion of this Islamic State would doubtless be a threat to international security, immediately a danger to the Kurdistan regional government, the Kurdish regional government in Iraq, to Lebanon and to Jordan, as well as to opposition-held territory in Syria. That's what we are seeing these days. I think they're also immediate threat to Saudi Arabia, not so much that we think they would take the Humvees they have occupied, they have conquered, captured from the Iraqi army and drive into Saudi Arabia, but rather because they enjoy so much support inside the kingdom. Further expansion of that entity would cause more waves of refugees into states which are already overburdened with refugees. And as long as they are successful, more jihadists or would-be jihadists will be recruited from our countries, including mine, including yours, and some of these people will return to our countries. Now, this may probably be a point of debate or conversation between us. I must admit, I'm not so much, and despite all what I said, I'm not so much concerned with the 15 or 20 or 30,000 fighters which they have been recruiting so far. What is more worrying to me are two other things. One, the limited degree of resistance we are seeing in Mosul, in Raqqa, in Deir ez-Zor against the control or the rule of the Islamic State. People do arrange themselves, not necessarily because they like the Islamic State or because they like their behavior, but rather because they don't see an alternative, because the governments in Baghdad or in Damascus don't seem for them to be an alternative. They rather feel or have felt marginalized, excluded, subdued by these governments. And what is also alarming, probably as alarming to me, is that the Sunni part of the coalition against the Islamic State and the Sunni part of the coalition, or the regional part of the coalition, which is led, of course, by Saudi Arabia, doesn't have any convincing ideological alternative to the narrative or the discourse of the self-declared caliph. This religious political discourse of the so-called Islamic State, their message of takfir, which means excluding other Muslims, their totalitarian interpretation of Islam and Sharia, their hatred against Shias, everything of that you can hear in a Friday prayer in Buraida in Saudi Arabia, and a lot of that you can read in Saudi school books. And this, I think, is a real problem, since Saudi Arabia is leading the Arab part of the coalition against the Islamic State. All this means that the so-called Islamic State is both a driver and an effect of the dissolution of order in the Middle East. So, what to do? I think that's a question which one always should put in Washington, even though one doesn't have an answer, or I don't have an answer. Given the threat, definitely the United States, and I have a couple of answers, but that doesn't necessarily mean having an answer. Given the threat, I think the US and European states definitely need to support regional states and other regional partners, such as the KRG, the Kurdish Regional Government, in containing and ideally rolling back the so-called Islamic State. At the same time, it is clear to me, and I know that this is a point of discussion here in DC, that outsiders, and we are outsiders, can only help to enable regional partners. And that's a real political and military struggle, which will take years, I think, has to be led by local actors. That's not only because we aren't prepared to engage for a long period in that region again, but it is also because we lack the credibility. We would lack the credibility to go in there and take upon our shoulders a task to rebuild states and societies or regional order, which is exactly what has to be done, but not by outsiders, has to be done by local forces. Military power has to be used. I think that's true, but it can only degrade the Islamic State. It cannot rebuild Syria or Iraq, and it cannot make Egypt or Lebanon or Jordan or Saudi Arabia more resilient against the political and ideological threat and the military threat of this phenomenon. Staying out, of course, or only containment wouldn't be enough. Concentrating on humanitarian aid only, as important as it is, wouldn't be enough either. I do think that the strategy outlined by the American president, which is basically a combination of military strikes to stop the expansion of the Islamic State, helping to form a more inclusive government in Baghdad, involving the regional neighbors, and strengthening moderate forces in Syria. I think that these four elements are basically the right choice of elements. I think the strategy is right, but I don't know whether it will succeed. And that is basically for three reasons. I'm going to end with that. Three big question marks to a strategy which I think is basically right. First, I don't know whether we will have a genuine policy or mentality change in Baghdad. That is, whether even the new government will actually full-heartedly accept the idea of inclusiveness and decentralization, which is, I think, necessary. Without that, without fully accepting the idea of inclusiveness and also decentralization, in my view, there's no hope to rescue Iraq as a state, not even as a federalist or confederalist entity, and no hope of regaining the loyalty of Sunni Arabs for the state and the capital in Baghdad. Second point, there is something which we all know, or many of us know, but usually don't acknowledge, that is, without a detente between Iran and Saudi Arabia, between Tehran and Riyadh, without a de-escalation at least of their struggle for regional hegemony, there is little hope of the sectarian polarization in the region receding, of getting this sectarian spirit back into the bottle, if it ever comes back into the bottle. The consequence, the policy consequence for us, for outside actors, would be, I think, strong diplomatic engagement with both, with Riyadh and with Tehran. And even though that seems unconnected, and everybody says it's unconnected, an additional interest to find a settlement over the nuclear dispute with Iran. I don't have an ideal solution here. I can only say we do have a real policy dilemma here. And my priority, if I was asked, and I was advising the German government, I am advising the German government, would be to concentrate not so much on the number of centrifuges which the Iranians can have after a deal, but rather on our interest in securing a cooperative Iran or Iranian cooperation, both on the Islamic State and on ending the conflict in Syria. And that's the third and last question mark or problem. We cannot solve the IS problem, the Islamic State problem, without dealing with the situation in Syria. I hear three different policy propositions which I think are all wrong. The one is Syria is gone anyway, so drive the Islamic State out of Iraq into Syria and let them have fun there and we rescue Iraq. The second is let them kill each other. They are all bad guys anyway, so just wait until the fight is over and no one's left. And the third one is let us recognize that Assad, after all, is the lesser evil and make up with him. I think all three propositions, which I hear from different quarters in Europe and here, all of them are wrong. What I think we need to do, even though it's difficult, and again, I don't have a sort of recipe for success, is to need every effort to end the war in Syria, the war between the regime army and the moderate or non-jihadist opposition, and start a political process which would allow a inclusive government to be set up in Syria as well. Ideally, I would try to reach that through a multitude of local ceasefires between the Syrian army and non-jihadist rebels that would spare them, the non-jihadist rebels, a two-front war. It would probably lead to a stabilization of fronts, green lines, as we had them in the Lebanese civil war or in other civil wars. That would make the delivery of humanitarian aid much easier, and it would actually help civilian actors in the region to set up their own businesses and administration again. And it might improve the chances for a political process, which ideally, but I know it's only ideally, would be following the Maliki model, or the getting Maliki out of power model, preserving most of the regime, preserving the state and the army, and form a more inclusive government. Maybe we shouldn't talk too much about Bashar al-Assad at this moment, and hoping that enough people, even on the regime side, know that they cannot continue as they did in the last 3 years. And indeed, there is an increasing number, we're seeing that. This attempt to arrange local ceasefires, etc., is certainly a task for the United Nations. We do have a new good special envoy there, Mr. de Mistura, but it also needs a cooperation with Iran, with Russia, and with Saudi Arabia, and all that doesn't make things easier. It's clear for me, though, that whatever our difficulties with each of these powers, we cannot try to isolate them or keep them out if we want to get anything solved in Syria, in Iraq, or in the broader region. Thanks for your listening.
Thank you, Volker. That was an excellent presentation and very analytically rich. We'll open it up for comments and questions. Questions preferred from the floor. But let me kind of lead off. What I really liked about your presentation is that you looked at kind of basic forces that are driving events in the region, questions of ideology and identity. Historians often debate the issue of agency, internal agency, external agency, and running through that is the issue of structure. So if you look at the question of structure and agency, the structures are under stress to the point of breaking, if not broken. And you began by referencing Sykes-Picot and whether something resembling Syria and Iraq will emerge from this process. You have in the Islamic State essentially a revolutionary power. It doesn't want to be integrated into the international system. It's offering an alternative version of order that is incompatible essentially with a state system which had its origins in Europe and was exported around the world, and which we celebrate every year in the United Nations General Assembly with 144 or whatever, states, each with a flag and asserting state sovereignty. You also made excellent points about the absence of a counter-narrative to what the Islamic State is offering, and the dilemma for outside powers that the local partners are weak, and that the strategy that's been advanced by President Obama really is it's a state-based strategy relying on regional neighbors to come together to address a kind of a greater threat, and a context within which you would think that Tehran and Riyadh would try to sort out their differences and focus on the primary threat of the Islamic State. But in the absence of those conditions, one has airstrikes conducted by external powers, and this really goes to the question of agency, and it has resonance going back, historically to the colonial period, but most acutely in the period since the U.S. led invasion of Iraq. That when Western powers become involved in the region, it opens the door to charges of the new crusaders. That military action, their involvement is viewed as being kind of less legitimate, and has all the questions associated with sort of an external power kind of exerting its will, attempting to exert its will in this region, imposing a kind of an order on it. So could you just elaborate on the themes of the role of outside powers? I would also open the door on the question of Germany's role in all this, since you are at the SWP, and there is interest in Germany as sort of a central power in all of this. The outside powers are being led by the NATO powers, and NATO, which is a regional organization, had this debate in earlier periods of out of area or out of business. Now these NATO powers, France, UK, United States, are involved in military action. It's really kind of a comment, and I guess my question is, what do you think of what I just said? Would you react to that? Thank you.
Well, I could say I agree, and then we ask for other questions.
That's fine too.
But
No, I'm really on the question of agency, and structure.
And well, I think I made clear, and you basically summarized it. The structure is broken, and it's agents that are breaking it up even more. And we don't have the agents who are prepared, willing, able to put it together again. And what foreign agents, no, that's a wrong word. What external agents, external actors can do is very limited. I think we are acting because we see that there is a threat to international security, which also always means our security, right? And that is, thanks for asking me for the German role. Something has happened in Berlin, which I, as a close Merkel observer, wouldn't have thought about a year or two that it would happen, or wouldn't have expected to happen. That we have decided very quickly to send arms to supporting a party in a conflict in the Middle East, and thereby, of course, becoming partisan, becoming a party in the conflict. Aside from sending patriots to Israel in 1991, we haven't done that. Yes, we're sending U-boats here and there, but sort of not into a conflict in order to actually intervene in a battle or try to define the outcome of a battle or a struggle. And that is also because there is a realization that there is a threat. And there is a threat by the expansion of this phenomenon, Islamic State. So what we can do, I think, is actually limited. So we have actors in the region who, for different reasons, aren't willing, aren't able to do what I think they should do. I consciously used the other European model, which is the Vienna Congress, sort of after a devastating war, having all basically the conservative forces coming together and say we need to reestablish order. But everybody, regardless of faith or political direction or rank, is coming together, and everybody has a right to speak here. And we're sitting together for 8 months. That was 1815, almost 200 years ago, and then trying to reestablish a concept of powers, or establish a concept of powers. Regional powers are not yet able to do that. I think they should. And what international powers can do is very limited. If we were to involve us again, as the United States did in 2003 upwards, or the French and the British did in the 1920s, I think it would exactly be what the Islamic State or similar actors would want us to do. It would legitimize their action. If they would behead the first American serviceman or the first German serviceman that falls into their arms, we might not like that, but I guess a lot of people, even outside their immediate area of control, would cheer it and would say, yes, the invaders, the colonizers, the crusaders should be out. So I don't think we should do it. I think we should enable, it's our interest to contain the danger, to contain the threat. We should enable local powers as much as possible. We should cooperate with every entity that functions and has a minimum of inclusive rule, but not try to engineer it himself. We wouldn't succeed.
Thanks. Let's open it up to the floor now. There's microphones. If speakers could please identify themselves. Gentleman here.
Thank you. Ali ELIAMEP from the Center for Democracy and Human Rights in Saudi Arabia, located here in Washington, D.C. I think there is an alternative to this mess in the Middle East, and that is to empower Arab women. The West have failed miserably and continuing to support absolute dictatorships in the region for the last 100 years or even more. Now we have an alternative, and that is empowering Saudi women, Arab women, especially in Saudi Arabia. Incidentally, the Saudi women activists are renewing their demand to be allowed to drive. So watch for the internet and support them. Question is, what will the impact be, given your presentation that the region is disintegrating, and it is, on the remaining absolute dictators in the Arab world, especially in the Gulf states?
Just would mention, Middle East Director Hales Fandiari has written sort of powerfully on the issue of ISIS's treatment of, barbaric treatment of women, and there's a publication online. She had a Wall Street Journal article on that topic as well. Volker?
Okay, very briefly, because I saw a couple of hands up there. I think you're right to point to what I call one of the most important factors of the social demographic development, and that, of course, is the female part of society. What I find, what makes me hopeful with regard to Saudi Arabia and other states in the Arab Gulf is that for the first time in history, young Arab women on the peninsula are better educated than, guess who? Not their mothers. Are better educated than their fathers. And that has a lot of explosive revolutionary force if young women are better educated than their fathers. And that is what you see mirrored or reflected in the social media, etc. So therefore I said that these turbulences which start from domestic conflicts about who gets what and who is included and who is excluded and who is dealt with in a dignified manner, that this turbulence will reach all the states in the region, including, of course, the ones you mentioned.
Okay. Question in the middle there? Thank you.
Hi, Sharon Weiner, former U.S. diplomat. I wonder if you could comment, please, on one of the regional actors or would-be actors that you have not addressed at all, and that is Turkey, who shares long borders with both Syria and Iraq as a NATO ally. How do you see their potential role and what they're doing so far?
Well, I think I see them doing a lot of wrong things that are wrong. They're closing the borders to the wrong people, and they're opening the borders to the wrong people. I would love to write the speech for President Erdogan where he announces that he has sent his tanks over the border to rescue Kobane, and that this is part of his peace process with the Kurds, and that it has otherwise nothing to do with politics, but is humanitarian. And once he has driven the Islamic State 10 or 20 kilometers from Kobane, he will withdraw and hand over to the local forces. This would do a lot to advance the peace process between the state of Turkey and the PKK. It would probably not even be protested by the regime in Damascus, and I think Erdogan couldn't care less whether he has a protest note from Damascus. I think that the Turks, the Turkish government, as many other actors in the region, have begun to climb a very steep learning curve, because they thought 3 years ago that Bashar al-Assad would fall almost as easily as other dictators in the region, and it only needed a little of their support, regardless to whom, and that they could deal with those who they supported later. We have heard the same from Saudi princes, and we had the same idea in Turkey. I think they are learning that this is wrong. I appreciate the difficulties of Mr. Erdogan to say, I don't want to have Kurdish entities all around me, but he has learned, and Turkey has learned, and I think sort of historically he has had a very positive role here. He has learned to live with the KRG. They have very good relations, and they should try to get the same kind of understanding with their Kurdish neighbors in the immediate south, that means in Syria.
Thank you. Kent Hughes in the back. And then come with you.
Kent Hughes here at the center. You can't have a caliphate without Mecca and Medina. How soon do you see an ISIS-inspired uprising in Saudi Arabia and external pressure by ISIS on the Saudi state?
Well, I guess you can have a caliphate without Mecca and Medina, and you have had it. I mean, when there was a struggle between the Abbasids and the Fatimids, only one of them could have Mecca and Medina at a time. Still, what I said, and I would maintain that, I think the risk for Saudi Arabia is not so much Humvees with Islamic State fighters rolling in there from Iraq, but rather sympathy from within. I cannot answer your question when that will happen or how it will happen. Ask one of the prophets from the Middle East. They are better at that.
Okay, in the front row here, or third row? Second row, excuse me. Woman has a question. woman. Thank you.
Marta Verbetic from Gallaudet University, Washington, D.C. In your opinion, this eventual reordering of the Middle East, will it involve the change of the borders that will be recognized internationally? And what consequences will it have for other regions in the world?
I guess I didn't understand you. A recognition of what?
This eventual reordering of the Middle East, will it involve the change of the borders?
Oh.
And what larger consequences will it have?
Well, I think what we see
It's easier to govern.
I got you now. Thank you. I think what we're seeing is that borders are losing practical relevance. And we are seeing it through the actions of the Islamic State. We're seeing it through the actions of Hezbollah, of the Syrian regime, of the Iranian regime. We're also seeing it, of course, through the American and Allied bombing campaign. So borders don't have the same relevance, practical relevance, as they used to have. I don't think we should put on our agenda as a redrawing of borders. It may happen, it may not happen. If people from the region ask my advice, I would tell them, think about decentralization, think about federal models, but don't think about redrawing borders. It may still happen. It may well be that in Syria, once there is a peace process, if there is a peace process, people in the northeast will say they will never again live under a centralized government in Damascus. No, there are at least two alternatives here. The one is you draw a border and have another landlocked little entity, or you think about a confederalist and federalist model, and I think that is probably the wiser choice.
Okay. This gentleman here.
I'm Mohammed Mansour. I'm an Egyptian journalist, and I covered the Egyptian Revolution, the Libyan Revolution, and many other countries. And my question is, in my opinion, Islamic extremism and sectarianism, the only way to deal with them is to contain them, because you will never get rid of them, especially in the Middle East. But the idea here is that the only people who were able to contain extremism are moderate Muslim Brotherhood. And when dictatorship came, they bought moderate Islamists in the corner and cracked down on them, and the only alternative was extremist Islamism. What do you think of this?
I don't agree that the Muslim Brotherhood are the only people able to contain Islamic extremism, but I do think, I'm convinced that you are not containing Islamic extremism by banning the Muslim Brotherhood or putting their people in jail. Only by opening up the political spectrum and allowing for a pluralist political spectrum where there is place for a force like the Muslim Brotherhood, I think you can contain the most extremist elements.
Yes.
Catherine Bova, Search for Common Ground. I was wondering, with the rise of, I would guess, sympathizers in Northern Africa and the Maghreb, as well as, copycat activities that are widely publicized, what can, if anything, the international community be doing now in the Maghreb, in Northern Africa, to prevent the rise of the Islamic State through that region?
My shortest answer is one word, and it is Tunisia.
Good.
Okay, good.
This
Let's
gentleman,
support
and
that
then the gentleman in the back. But first, this one.
My name is Christian Madsen. I'm a journalist based here in DC. Obviously, former Secretary Panetta has been talking a lot these past few days about his new book and criticizing his former boss. And even Jimmy Carter's piled on, saying that Obama blew it on ISIL. Looking back in hindsight, what is your analysis? Where, if anywhere, did the Obama administration go wrong? And how is this viewed in Berlin? Are they looking at it as a successful American leadership, or are people shaking their heads?
They're actually not shaking their heads so much. In Berlin, we do like policymakers who who make clear that they are thinking before they act. So we weren't so troubled when Mr. Obama said he doesn't have a strategy yet. We thought it was probably the natural thing at that stage to say, well, we don't have a strategy yet. I know the political culture is different here. Even if you don't have a strategy, you have to say you have one. But we weren't as troubled by that. I personally was of the opinion that after the chemical weapons attacks in Syria, something stronger should have been done, that it would have been the moment where it would have been legitimate and probably wise to tell the Syrian Air Force that one more sortie and you're not going to fly again, and do that without flying over Syria. You can do that with cruise missiles, I think. But the political elite in my country, including the Chancellor, were quite happy about the way it was handled by Washington and Moscow, we have to say, at that point, to say let's work on the chemical weapons here and take sort of one of the arms out of his reservoir. So we are not so critical, and I think the main question we are having here is if that strategy, which he is following, the American government is following now, and we are part of this coalition, we think it is right, but we don't know whether it will succeed.
It's always difficult to predict or to handle a major discontinuity like what's happened in the Middle East, and there's always a tendency to say, why couldn't it have been predicted or planned for better, but it was a major discontinuity. I recall a meeting of academics at the Wilson Center that talked about the end of the Cold War and German unification, and the political scientists were there being taken to task. Well, why didn't you predict that Germany was going to be unified? And we had a German diplomat who says, Foreign Minister Genscher didn't know that Germany was going to be unified. How's a political scientist going to be able to figure out whether it's going to be unified or not? Gentleman in the back has been waiting.
Hamid Lilou, Middle East analyst at Operational Culture, Marine Corps University. I agree with you. Local problems, they need local solutions, if I understood. But how can you ask a coalition of Arab nation militaries who have not shown any military success, 48, 67, 73, except putting down popular upheavals or doing military coups within the same country? Add to that, their doctrines don't allow them to go outside their borders, and they don't have such as joint forces culture. Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure we can really can compare everything, but I think the state of training in the air forces in Saudi Arabia and Emirates is a bit better than it was in 1948. Emirates wasn't there as a state at that point, but I think something has improved there. And if the Air Force of the United Arab Emirates is able to bomb in Libya, I don't know why they shouldn't be able to fly together with a coalition of others in Syria or Iraq. But I guess if you would, I don't know, and I haven't asked any, but if you would ask an American commander, or the head of the U.S. Air Force, the most important thing is sort of the symbolic aspect of the contribution of these armies in the bombing campaign. Then I think when it comes to stabilizing Iraq, to stabilize Syria, they need a lot of support from their Arab neighbors. But it's not only military, it starts by politically supporting an inclusive government in Iraq. That is nothing the Saudis would have done in the past. I mean, they haven't sent an ambassador there for a long time because they didn't think that there should be a Shiite prime minister, for example. So there is a lot of things the Arabs could do which goes well beyond about having an army that could win in a new 48 or 67 type of war.
Okay. Take a few more questions.
Shall we collect a few?
Yeah, why don't we collect this woman here, there, and there. We'll have those three, and then...
Yeah, hi, I'm Jennifer Bremer from SIIS. It seems that the U.S. strategy, or whatever you want to call it, really depends on having a viable force within Syria, a moderate force, and that seems to me to be a real weak point, and there's no sign that these groups can come together politically or militarily and form a viable fighting force anytime soon. And I'm wondering, and what the implications of that are, or if you disagree.
Thank you. And second question here. Then we'll come to you. Just 1 second. Go ahead.
Thank you for your talk. My name is Anushya Ray. I work on the foreign policy portfolio for Senator Bernie Sanders. I recently completed my doctoral dissertation in Afghanistan and lived and worked in Kabul. So my question to you is based on my experience in Afghanistan. You spoke a lot about the sectarian divisions and also more specifically about the struggle within Sunni Islam. How do you think liberal voices within Islam can reclaim the space from the Salafi or Wahhabi ideology that forms the cornerstone of ISIS? Thank you.
And finally, yes?
Diane Seeger, Washington Post. How can propaganda be contained for jihad recruitment? They seem to be using the media and the internet very effectively. How can that be contained?
Should I try to answer the three questions? The lady from SIIS, I disagree only modestly. Yes, today the moderate forces in Syria are, if someone is contained, it's a moderate forces. They hold still a few parts of Idlib province, south of Damascus, parts of Aleppo, but they have been decimated and disagreeing among themselves hasn't helped them a lot. What we see and why I think that a strategy to support them can have some success is that many of the fighters that are joining different forces in Syria are rather opportunistic in a way that they go where the money is. You cannot even blame them for them because they want to feed themselves, they want to feed their family. And the most radical factions have always had more money than the moderate factions from the beginning of the civil war in Syria. The FSA could rarely pay them a regular salary, sometimes $50 a month, and then that was interrupted. Nusra Front and of course the Islamic State are paying more, and they're paying on a regular basis. So supporting the remaining moderate forces could make a change. And success breeds success. So once you have better trained, at least a couple of better trained battalions there, you have people who get money, who have fresh arms. I think more people would go there. On Afghanistan, it wasn't actually a question on Afghanistan, but you could take Afghanistan as an example for your question. If an inclusive government, even though probably both leaders didn't really want to have an inclusive government, but sort of by force majeure, they are now forced to build an inclusive government. If this inclusive government holds and then make it through to the next elections, for example, that would be a way of reclaiming space for sort of liberal, secular Islam. The same, I repeat again, Tunisia. If we all make Tunisia succeed, have it a beacon of a genuine transformation, where you have Islamists and secular people and certainly a culture of Islam, people working together, that would allow liberal or secular forces to reclaim space in the region. If we help Lebanon to succeed with a very, very inclusive and very difficult government, if we help Jordan to succeed, if we help even the Moroccan monarch, who is not necessarily a liberal, but probably the most liberal you can have among monarchs in the Arab world, to succeed from his sort of process of transforming the country from above, that would help to reclaim space for the liberals. As to containing the propaganda, I don't think we should start by cutting the freedom of the internet or trying to compartmentalize, that's a difficult word, the internet. What we need is a better propaganda. And that starts, we're thinking basically about what we could do in our countries. I've said so much what local forces should do. What we need is probably there are a couple of returnees, quite a number of returnees from Syria, who came back from there because they were shocked that this was not the Islam they saw. They realized they were lured into it, radicalized, thought they would. Some of them went there because they thought they would fight for the freedoms of the Muslims against Bashar al-Assad. They ended up seeing that Muslims are basically killing Muslims. You need some of these returnees, 1, 2 per country, to speak up. You need to give them the shelter. You need to give them the opportunity to say what they really saw there, that this is not fighting for Islam. I think that is much more convincing than having the Sheikh al-Azhar or the Mufti of Saudi Arabia declare that those people are ghulat and we are now fighting them.
Well, this has been analytically very rich. Please join me in thanking Volker Perthes for an excellent presentation. Thank you for coming today.